Let's look at some historic examples of what this may have looked like when it manifests in different geographical and civilizational contexts. In terms of Near Eastern examples, we have the following from Martti Nissanen, The Akkadian Rituals and Poetry of Divine Love. Quote, we only have a collection of random hints, which, however, leave no room for doubt that the rituals were indeed celebrated from the Neo-Assyrian to the late Babylonian or Seleucid period in different Mesopotamian cities. And not only that, but they also provide occasional glimpses at the details and venues of the ceremonies. And in Pongratz Leyston's Sacred Marriage and the Transfer of Divine Knowledge, alliances between the gods and the king in Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, we read the following. What the ancients in the Near East have left us are numerous documents dealing with cultic prescriptions regulating interaction with the gods in the daily and festal cults. These divinatory texts and literary texts witness to a variety of key metaphors. One of the key metaphors used to express the close communication between gods and the king was sacred marriage. Sacred marriage can take many forms. Cosmogamy, the union between the cosmic elements of heaven and earth. Hierogamy, the union between a goddess and a king, and theogamy, the union between a god and a goddess. While cosmogamy remains restricted primarily to literary texts, that is, to cosmologies, hierogamy and theogamy find their places within the complex communication process between the gods and the king. Therefore, they become part of the narratives and rituals regulating the interaction between the divine and the human spheres. Often cited example is that of the Daijosai, which is a ritual when a Japanese emperor comes into his post, wherein the emperor spends a night with the sun goddess Amaterasu, from which the imperial line is said to descend. Now, this is from a CNN article in which we read that in the 1920s, the belief accepted by the state was that the emperor had conjugal relations with the sun goddess, apparently, but that view has sort of fallen into disfavor, and it also makes sense because there's been a secularizing of the imperial post. The emperor now does not claim to be divine. It's interesting that his not claiming to be divine coincides with the notion that there is no carnal or conjugal relation with the goddess any longer. In the Cambodian case, we have a 13th century Chinese traveler to the Angkor Wat complex in Cambodia called Zhou Daguan, who wrote in his journals that the king of Khmer would sleep with a magical nine-headed Naga, a snake person. That's from Indian tradition. You get Nagas in the main Indian epics, like the Mahabharata, for example. So these are serpent creatures, intelligent, sentient serpent creatures. Some are good, some are bad. But anyway, that the king of Khmer in Angkor Wat would sleep with, have relations with, a nine-headed Naga woman every night at the top of his tower, and that if he should fail to do so, it was considered to bode badly for the health of the kingdom. Now, importantly, neither the Japanese nor the Cambodian case, nor many of these equivalent cases, talk about an offspring who is then half human, half divine being produced from these unions. Rather, the idea here is that the king receives power, knowledge, etc., to continue ruling by way of a union, a carnal union in some respect, an actual erotic union with a supernatural being. Perhaps the point is that what's being conceived and rebirthed is the polity itself, the political entity itself. That's the giant. The higher principle or concept of correspondence is replaced by a spirit who reifies it and turns it towards idolatry. Like any confusion of the planes, this leads to gigantism, where the immanent or historical or political plane is made to bear the weight of grander spiritual principles, thus the imperialism and totalitarianism that result. But that's for another video on Gigantomachy, on the War of the Giants.
Not siding here with the disenchantment of the world and losing the romance and the deeper meaning of ritual. It's the opposite. I'm saying that certain errors might be interwoven in some inherited traditions and need to be rectified, but there's a middle way between secular materialism and idolatrous superstition. And we have the example of Roman imperial symbolism, for example, which was largely salvaged and reworked outside of its initial idolatrous context. It's not a perfect example, but it marks the way.
Let's dig in a little more into the philosophical and metaphysical underpinnings of this Nephilim ritual and where it goes wrong. If we think of reality as consisting of two fundamental forces, the eternal masculine and the eternal feminine, yang and yin, heaven and earth, Aristotle's essence and substance. The one is analogous to shape, like a circle, and the other to color, say blue. But every circle we encounter in the world has to have some particular color, and every instance of color will be in some shape. If we try to unite a particular shape with the abstract category of color, or some color with shape as such, we fail necessarily. And if we think we've drawn a circle that has no color, a pure circle that transcends color, we're only pretending that its color, whatever it happens to be, is somehow neutral and universal, transcending the limitations of color. And that's what imperialism consists of, for example, pretending that a set of particular features are universal and so ending up imposing them on everybody. In human terms, and returning to the issue of bedchamber rituals in the ancient world, the proper order of things is for a wife and husband to be analogous to the universal categories of earth and heaven. Their union serves as a microcosm of the macrocosmic correspondence between the eternal feminine and masculine. If one attempts to unite with the universal as such, pretending that the latter universal is some definite being, a god, that they can mate with, they're succeeding only in uniting with some counterfeit, because a particular being cannot relate to the universal on its own plane. A human can't mate with an archetype, with a god, any more than a circle can be drawn in color as such, and not in some specific color. Okay, so that's the sort of philosophical mistake I think that ultimately is being made in these kinds of rituals. And the Bible does present the gender swapped version at the end in the apocalypse, where the whore of Babylon and the kings of the earth fornicating with her is basically a recurrence of the Nephilim theme. The abominations in her cup are like the giants. And the result there, just as the parody of masculinity was to try to apply unity of principle on the created plane, and it results in gigantism, the female principle of harmony, that's likewise literalized, ends up in celebrating every possible form in every possible combination. So instead of harmony, chaos. The cup of abominations, everything mixed together, the orgy, just as in the case of the masculine, instead of unity, uniformity. Giants consuming everything, joining everything together, both end up resulting in a loss of distinction, a loss of forms. Tower of Babel, Cup of Abominations are just two different gendered formats of the same satanic parody of Eden. What this kind of political prostitution looks like today is that political elites will not court their own society. Instead, they will court supposed representatives of universal principles of the international society. It's more important to get funding from private equity managers or international institutions and conform to their political schemes than it is to be favored by your local constituents. And as that happens, which is a version of the kings of the earth fornicating with the whore of Babylon, you get the giants, the abominations, massively uniformalizing monocultural systems of control start to develop, reproducing the Tower of Babel dynamic. We have an anthropological theme that's observable across traditions in which political elites often want to be foreign with respect to the people that they rule. The Aztec emperor Moctezuma famously said to Hernan Cortez that he and the rest of the Aztec ruling class originated from somewhere across the eastern sea. In other words, that they came from where Cortez had come from, unlike the bulk of the population, the bulk of the Mexica and other peoples ruled by them. But it's a very general, observable tendency, writes Mary Helm in Access to Origins, Affinities, Ancestors, and Aristocrats. Quote, elite claims of foreign affiliation and identification served to disconnect or distance Maya lords from their subjects. End quote. She's discussing this phenomenon in terms of the Mesoamerican Mayan civilization. Andreas Stone, in Disconnection, Foreign Insignia, and Political Expansion, describes the same thing as the implementation of an exclusive dynastic line which defines itself in terms of palpably different qualities not seen in the general population. The point is that there's this conception, which is at times promoted by the elite itself, that it is foreign with respect to the general population, and that such a conception can lead to extravagances in the exercise of power, to tyranny ultimately. The Nephilim ritual would be an extreme case of that idea, right? And the idea of being divine and mythologizing the origins of a dynasty as having some non human origin, a progenitor who did not belong to the human species, the ultimate foreigner, would open up the king to conceive of himself as so different from the normal, ordinary subject that political authority could be exercised in this hyperbolic, tyrannical way because we belong to different species. And that which is appropriate for me is completely different from that which is appropriate to you as a commoner.